Perusing the custom Hearthstone subreddit, you'll soon find that a lot of the cards are tagged humorous, and these are meme cards that people make to complain about the game, make a joke about certain cards, or make cards solely based off of puns. But every once in a while, I see one of these cards and I think to myself, you know what, that could actually work in the game. So I present to you more humorous cards that could actually work in Hearthstone. First up is the Lorax, 5 mana 4/4 Druid Legendary with the battle cry, transform your Ancients into 8/8 Primevals with charge. So these Ancients refer to Tree Speaker, which is a 5 mana 4/4 for Druid that transforms your treants into 5/5 Ancients. Originally I was excited about Tree Speaker being put in the game, but in reality transforming a bunch of 2/2s into 5/5s isn't really worth that much value. But if you were to get treants out on your board, play Tree Speaker, and then the Lorax, you'd be able to get a bunch of 8/8s with charge. And I think the charge is the more important part because you can instantly deal that 8 damage and get all of that value. In its final third form, the trees finally get to fight back. So I think this would be an interesting card to add to the game. You'd probably want to play Tree Speaker and this out on the board at the same time, and if you're able to get 4 other treants out on the board, then you're going to be able to deal 32 damage. I definitely don't think it would make a treant deck viable, but I think the Lorax would give people that enjoy the deck at least some sort of hope that they might be able to win a game. Next up is Eggsodia, 6 mana 1/1 legendary neutral beast with the battle cry, if you control 6 eggs, destroy the enemy hero. As you may know, eggs hold a special place in my heart, and I think Eggsodia is a great card to emphasize how difficult it would actually be to get 6 eggs out on the board. Not only are opponents more aware of the power of certain eggs, and sometimes they'll destroy them so that you can't use any Death Rattle activators, but just getting them out on the board is also pretty difficult, because if you're going to get 6 out on the board, you either have to use the cube or you have to play a lot of different eggs. And it's not like there's a second option with this card, it is all or nothing. If you don't get this card's battle cry and win the game, then it's just a 6 mana 1/1. And because of its 6 mana cost, you can't really do all of this in one single turn. So while I don't think this would legitimately be a competitive card, if you did put it in the game, I'm sure there would be some people, including myself, that would get this combo and have a lot of fun doing it. Next up is Mr. Terrible, 6 mana 3/4 legendary neutral with the battle cry, summon a 5/1 Rager and a 1/4 Gorilla with taunt. Now of course, Magma Rager and Silverback Patriarch are notoriously poor cards, mainly because they have terrible stat distribution. With Magma Rager you get 6 stats for 3 mana, but because it's at 1 health, your opponent can cheaply and easily get rid of it, really negating the rest of its stats. And Silverback Patriarch, well, that card always gets power creeped. But with Mr. Terrible, for 6 mana you're getting 9/9 in stats. And both Magma Rager and Silverback Patriarch have taunt. And so Mr. Terrible presents the question, is it worth getting a lot of stats, even if it's not distributed well? In a way, it reminds me of a weaker version of Giggling Inventor, because the main use of this card isn't necessarily to clear the enemy board, but it's to get annoying taunt stats out on the board. A lot of the times, maybe your opponent is just going to trade a small minion or ping into Magma Rager, but then they also still have to deal with Silverback Patriarch. And so that's 5 damage that they have to put into 2 annoying taunt minions, and if things don't really line up, that can still be annoying. Still, the stat distribution is definitely a problem with this card, but if you're able to take advantage of these stats with a card like Void Terror, then maybe this could actually work. Or you could just buff these minions and raise their attack or health, allowing them to make better trades. Anytime you need some sort of 2-card combo for a card to work, it's a little bit worrisome. I think Mr. Terrible has some sort of potential, but it would still be a tough card to play. And next up we have Snorewalker Cho. Alright, here's our first pun. 2 mana 0/4 legendary neutral. Whenever a minion is played, it stays asleep for an extra turn. So whenever you play a minion, you see the little Z's above the card. That means the minion can't attack because it doesn't have rush or charge, and instead of being able to attack on the next turn, if Snorewalker Cho is out on the board, then they have to wait 2 turns. And this can be incredibly useful for more controlling decks trying to combat aggro, because if you play this out early enough and your opponent plays a minion, then they won't be able to attack for 2 turns and they can't start dealing damage to your face. This would allow you to buy more time and get to a higher mana crystal count, so you could start using your more expensive cards and board clears to deal with all the aggro. It's one of those cards that aggro decks would be super incentivized to get rid of right away. And even if they do remove it after 1 or 2 turns, you're still preventing some damage with the minions that they play, and it's going to take 4 damage from your opponent in order to get rid of this. It's a really unique alternative to taunt, and I think if you got this out on the board before your opponent could play anything, it would be really useful. Next up, we have Optimistic Ogre, 4 mana, 5/5 neutral minion with a 50% chance to hit the correct enemy. So this is a case of glass half empty, half full, and if you look at Ogre Brute, it's a 50% chance to attack the wrong enemy. So Optimistic Ogre, which has great artwork, just looks at the situation in a more positive attitude. It's a simple card, doesn't do anything new, but I like to think having this positive spin on the other Ogre cards would benefit the game. And next up, we have the Overcompensator, 10 mana, 50 attack, 1 durability, warrior weapon with overkill, fully heal your opponent. So the idea with this card is that if you equip this and attacked into the enemy hero, let's say they have 30 health and you dealt 50 damage to them, you would overkill, and then instead of actually killing your opponent, you would just heal them back to 50. Now maybe those who aren't as optimistic as the previous card would point out that if you kill your opponent, usually the game just ends and the overkill wouldn't activate, but I think for the case of this card, obviously this effect would take place before your opponent died and the game ended. But there's still a lot of applications for this card. First option is if your opponent has more than 50 health, then this will deal the 50 damage and probably leave them at a pretty low health total. And even if they don't have 50 health in total, usually if they're pretty high in health, it's because they also have a decent amount of armor. So even if you end up healing your opponent back up to 30 health, if you get rid of 15 armor, that's pretty decent. Plus, you don't necessarily have to kill your opponent. You could use this as some sort of board clear, and because it's in warrior, you could actually upgrade this weapon to give it more durability so you could swing multiple times. If your opponent is already at 30 health, then it doesn't matter if the overkill activates when you use this on some enemy minions. Still, at a 10 cost weapon, this is definitely a high investment. And then if your opponent has any sort of weapon removal, that is a big punishment. It's a super high-risk weapon with some unique stats and an interesting overkill feature. The card creator said that it was the stupidest idea they could think of, but I think it's a really interesting concept to have such a powerful weapon with one major flaw. Next up is Railgore the Briber, 6 mana, 3/4 neutral legendary, with the battle cry, if your opponent concedes on their next turn, add 10 gold to their account. Alright, now we're getting a little meta with this card. The thing is, whenever you win 3 games in Hearthstone, you get the 10 gold. So if you accept this bribe, basically you can take an L but also make 10 gold. I think on ladder though, where people are trying to rank up, this isn't really going to work unless it's played at the end of the game. And what I mean by that is if you're playing against aggro and you've been able to clear your board and you're at a reasonable health, then if you play this when your opponent might have less hope that they can win the game, this might be the card to push them over the edge and they'll concede right there. It can make your game shorter and it could give more gold to the community. Now I don't know if Blizzard would ever actually print a card like this. Because it's a battle cry, it would be interesting if you could actually double the gold so you could give your opponent 20 gold, and then maybe with Shutterwalk there'd be a way to give opponents hundreds of gold. It could definitely get out of hand, especially if you play against friends. So while I don't think Blizzard, the company, would want to print this card, I think if it was actually put into the game, it would be a really interesting and trolly card that people could use to try to end games quickly. Whether it would actually be competitive or not would be up to the community. Next up is On the House, 1 mana mage spell that shuffles a Millhouse Mana Storm into your opponent's deck. Millhouse is a 2 mana 4/4 with battle cry that makes your opponent's spells cost 0 for that turn. So by shuffling Millhouse Mana Storm into your opponent's deck, if they ever draw that minion, then if they choose to play it, you'll be able to have a turn of 0 cost spells. But another reason for shuffling Millhouse into your opponent's deck is because it's a 2 cost minion, and that means if they run Prince Keleseth, Millhouse will mess up that Keleseth battle cry. Your opponent won't get the Keleseth buff, and they'll also draw a 2 mana 4/4 that they don't really want to play. It's a really interesting card. It would be tough to play this as just a 1 mana spell with such low value, but I think getting it randomly off of other mage spells would be a great way of having this card change up games. And next up, we actually have a change to a card already in the game. Shaman's Hex transforms an enemy minion into a 0 mana 0/1 frog with taunt, and it's pretty rare, but anytime you actually get that frog back in your hand, it's pretty underwhelming when you play it out on the board as just a 0 mana 0/1. So this creator's idea was to instead, when it returns to your hand, make it a 1 mana 0/1 with taunt, and the battle cry transform into a random prince. And that could be the 2, 3, or 4 mana princes, as well as the other princes also in the game. It actually makes getting the frog back into your hand much more valuable, because either way you're getting pretty good stats for only 1 mana. Transforming a frog into a prince is a cute idea. Also, I think it would be a cool change that if you ever evolved a frog, it would also transform into one of these random princes, as opposed to just a random minion that's 1 more mana. It's a great idea and a fun change that maybe wouldn't have an effect on a lot of games, but when it did happen, I think it would be special. And last up, we have my favorite humorous card for this episode, the Perfect Specimen. 1 mana mage quest that requires you to transform a sheep into a sheep, and your reward is D077Y. And this minion is a 5 mana 3/3 sheep that has all of the tribes and is immune. And so the simplest form of transforming a sheep into a sheep is basically you have to cast Polymorph and then cast Polymorph again on that sheep. In Wild, there was Potion of Polymorph, and the Kazakus spell could actually turn some sheep into sheep. You also used to be able to play Explosive Sheep, which you could then just polymorph there. Even then, I would argue that the quest reward isn't that powerful. I think with the current cards, it would be perfectly fine as a nice little side quest you could try to use in a deck. And now, this card's got me thinking about a sheep mage deck. Well, those are all of the humorous cards for now. I'll continue to scour the subreddit to find more interesting humorous cards. If you want to check out some of my other videos, I just had the 40th episode of the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week, and I also made a video about the cutest fan-made Hearthstone cards. That is all for now, and until next time, ta-ta.